We're about to cross a threshold that should have remained sealed forever. A man who once wore the cloth has stepped forward. He brings no theories, only witness accounts. What he's prepared to share might shatter the very foundations of all we've accepted as truth. Secret chambers, concealed documents, history rewritten by those bound by sacred oaths. For decades he ministered within Vatican walls. He accessed forbidden archives. He studied pages, meant to stay buried for eternity. This isn't merely about banned writings or ancient ceremonies. This concerns the manipulation of time itself, of wisdom, of collective memory. Entire eras were moulded in shadows, while humanity sought guidance from Rome. Now someone from the inside breaks his silence, not in hushed tones, but completely. Watch the footage. Hit subscribe, because tonight we listen to the man who walked away. And once you learn what he discovered, everything changes. They claim the church has perfect memory, that wearing the collar binds you eternally. What they don't mention is what happens when that collar begins to suffocate you. I once belonged to their ranks. I recited prayers in ancient tongues. I traversed those resonating corridors of timeless stone. I believed without question. Yet truth has an uncanny ability to find weaknesses, and once it penetrates, it never departs. I didn't abandon the church because my faith in God wavered. I departed because I witnessed what they concealed in his honour. Certain chambers in the Vatican remain forever beyond most clergy's reach. Passages beneath passages, access granted only to select few. I was among that chosen group. Initially I considered it an honour, recognition for unwavering devotion. But the further I ventured, the dimmer the illumination became, until only unanswered questions remained. One particular evening stands vivid in memory. A tempest struck Rome. Electricity faltered, and I received summons to assist in an archive section most don't realise exists. No photography, no recording devices, only stillness and ancient dust and an odour resembling dried blood on yellowed parchment. I discovered scrolls predating any textbooks I'd studied, scripts in unknown languages that somehow felt familiar, documents telling alternate narratives of Genesis, of chronology, of humanity itself. That evening something shifted within me, like gazing into a reflection and seeing someone else staring back. I understood then that the historical account I'd been proclaiming wasn't complete truth. It wasn't even partial truth. It was theatre, and we were all performers reciting lines written generations before our birth. I maintained silence for months afterward. I continued the rituals. I conducted services. I heard confessions. I maintained composure before bishops harbouring secrets behind their gazes. But internally, I was disintegrating. The deceptions weren't just in the manuscripts. They lived in silence. In volumes we were forbidden to examine. In names erased from records, in years that simply disappeared. Eventually I departed. No fanfare, no farewell. I placed my collar upon the altar and stepped into the darkness. Since then, I've remained inconspicuous, but silence is no longer possible. The world deserves to know certain truths. Not to destroy faith, but to reconstruct it upon something genuine. Not fear, not dominance, truth. This is my testimony. Not the kind whispered in shadowy confessionals, but spoken boldly beneath open heavens. Because sometimes the gravest transgressions aren't individual acts. They're embedded in institutions, shielded by vestments, blessed by ceremonies hidden behind gold and marble. If you believe you understand the Vatican, reconsider. Because what I witnessed was forbidden knowledge, and what I read was meant to be forgotten. Until this moment, the religious community was perpetually hushed, always hushed. The type of silence that didn't bring peace, but vigilance, as if the very stones were eavesdropping. When I first arrived as a young novice, I believed it was sacred. a sanctuary where inquiries would find resolution and uncertainty would dissolve into conviction. But the longer I remained, the clearer it became that silence wasn't holy. It was mandated. We learned scriptural interpretation, but only through specific lenses. If you posed too many inquiries, even respectful ones, senior clergy would smile diplomatically and redirect conversations. If you persisted, they'd suggest meditation and abstinence. That became their signal. It meant cease questioning. Certain scriptures received intensive examination. Others were briefly mentioned and never revisited. And some names you only heard in murmurs after lights dimmed, and someone dared speak candidly. One early Christianity course transformed everything for me. The instructing priest was cautious, always reading directly from sanctioned materials. But during one session he inadvertently referenced a gospel I'd never encountered, the Gospel of Thomas. He stopped mid-sentence, immediately scanned the classroom, then said, "Disregard that. It wasn't included in official scripture." He continued, but I couldn't dismiss it. I approached him privately afterward, just us two. He studied me carefully and in barely audible tones said some writings were excluded for valid reasons. Then he departed. That night I visited the modest monastery library. Lighting was subdued and most volumes were secured behind glass cases. The accessible ones were identical translations endorsed by the Church. Theological summaries, biographical accounts of saints. But I began noticing absences. No source texts, no alternative perspectives, no space for personal interpretation. Just carefully selected knowledge repeated endlessly until it became accepted fact. We weren't simply studying scripture, we were learning thought patterns, or more precisely, learning not to think beyond established parameters. It was subtle manipulation. Nobody explicitly said stop thinking, they simply redirected you whenever you wandered. And gradually, most students complied. They nodded, they memorized, they passed examinations. They labelled it faith. But some of us whispered, in the gardens after evening prayers, in library corners. We discussed the forbidden books, the questions without answers. We began wondering if we were here to discover truth or to forget it. In the monastery, truth wasn't denied. It was filtered. We learned not to deceive, but never to deviate from the prescribed narrative. And in that silence, something ancient awakened. Not faith, but the sense that somewhere beyond layers of ritual and reverence, the authentic story awaited discovery. It never appeared on any blueprint. No corridor markers, no catalogue entries. But everyone within Vatican walls knew of its existence. They simply didn't acknowledge it. Like a phantom chamber built into the foundation long ago, concealed in obvious places. I discovered it accidentally. I'd been assigned to help an archivist deep within Vatican library holdings. Most tasks were mundane, cataloguing Latin manuscripts, cleaning ancient scrolls, transcribing inventory records. But the deeper you descended into the structure, the more the atmosphere transformed. Colder, denser, as if time decelerated the further you moved from daylight. That particular day, I was transporting a cart of books along one of the basement passages when I noticed a side corridor I'd never seen. It appeared unremarkable, just a plain stone archway, with a weathered wooden door at its end. But the overhead light was illuminated. That was peculiar. Nobody had ever directed me that direction, and the deeper sections were typically secured. I should have disregarded it. I should have reversed course. But something drew me forward. The door stood slightly ajar. I pushed it gently. It didn't groan. It simply opened. Inside was a narrow staircase lit by wavering bulbs. No security, no surveillance. Just silence. At the bottom was a heavy door constructed of iron and timber. It lacked a handle, but wasn't locked. I pushed it open and entered. It differed from the rest of the library. There were no organised shelves or labelled sections, no signs directing to scripture or saints. This chamber was disordered. Scrolls piled haphazardly, books without titles, manuscripts written in unrecognizable languages. Some weren't even properly stored. They were spread across tables as if recently examined and abandoned. And the scent, not merely dust, it smelled like antiquity itself, like objects left undisturbed for millennia. One parchment drew my attention. It was covered in unfamiliar symbols, circular designs, celestial charts, notes scribbled in Latin, Greek, and something more ancient. The text wasn't simply narrating events, it was cautioning someone. I felt it deep in my core, as if whatever this was, it wasn't meant for casual reading. I didn't hear the door open behind me, but suddenly I wasn't solitary. A figure entered the chamber, an elderly priest. He didn't shout, he didn't appear surprised. He simply observed me for an extended moment. Then he spoke one sentence. "You weren't supposed to witness this." He didn't elaborate. He didn't threaten me. He simply approached, removed the manuscript from my grasp and gestured for my departure. I never mentioned it again, not to anyone. But from that instant forward, I understood. The Vatican doesn't merely preserve history. It revises it, it curates it, and sometimes it entombs it, so deeply that even those serving within its walls forget what they're safeguarding or why. It began with a footnote, a minor line in a massive theological commentary we were required to study during preparation. It referenced a verse absent from our Bible version. Initially, I assumed it was a typographical error, but then I noticed something peculiar. That verse existed, just not in our translation and not in any version the Church permitted us to use. That small discovery became an obsession. I couldn't stop investigating. I began comparing biblical texts, the Latin Vulgate, the Greek Septuagint, the Coptic versions, even early Syriac fragments. And gradually a pattern emerged. Certain narratives shifted in tone. Certain names vanished. Complete passages were condensed or rephrased. Some texts contained warnings. Others had conclusions that felt truncated, as if someone had carefully trimmed the edges so everything would fit inside predetermined boundaries. One night remains unforgettable. I had managed to obtain a copy of the Gospel of Thomas, not through official means. It had been digitized from a deteriorating manuscript discovered in Egypt and translated by independent researchers. It was unfiltered. It didn't portray Jesus like the others did. No supernatural events, no resurrection, just teachings. Profound, enigmatic, provocative. And what struck me most was its completely different portrayal. Not a saviour from heaven, but an instructor of inner wisdom. A man encouraging people to seek within, not to follow blindly. I presented it to a senior priest I respected. He didn't even examine it. He simply looked at the cover and told me it was heretical, dangerous not because it was false, but because it wasn't intended for public consumption. He explained that the Church had decided long ago to safeguard the faithful, to keep the message pure and accessible. He said the early councils determined what was sacred and what was not, what was inspired and what was problematic. That word haunted me. Problematic. Not false, not wicked. Just something that didn't conform. I began investigating further. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Book of Enoch, the Gospel of Philip, all authentic, all excluded. Some suggested divine feminine principles. Others discussed celestial bodies and temporal cycles. Some questioned the very concept of sin, and everyone had been concealed, not destroyed, just buried, kept behind barriers or rewritten in languages nobody could access without authorization. It became obvious that the Bible as we know it isn't a perfect record. It's a selected anthology, chosen by humans, edited across centuries, translated in ways that served specific purposes. To guide faith, certainly, but also to consolidate power. When people claim the Bible is God's word, they don't realize how many human hands shaped it first, how many voices were silenced, how many truths were classified under heresy. And perhaps the most frightening aspect isn't that pages are absent. It's that we were never meant to know they were missing. It was meant to be a routine lesson, just another monotonous lecture on church calendars and sacred observances. But something felt wrong. We were learning how Easter is determined. It's calculated based on the first full moon following the spring equinox. Straightforward enough until one student raised his hand and asked a question nobody had ever dared ask before. What if the celestial bodies no longer align with those dates? The classroom fell silent. The instructing priest smiled but didn't respond immediately. He shifted uncomfortably. Then he mumbled something about tradition and authority. That was the first warning sign. If the church claims to follow heavenly patterns, then why were we disregarding what the sky actually reveals? That evening I remained in the library. I located an old almanac and began cross-referencing dates. The more I examined, the more perplexed I became. According to astronomical data, the spring equinox had shifted slowly, imperceptibly, across centuries. What previously occurred in Aries now happens in Pisces. Yet the church still maintained everything was perfectly synchronized. It wasn't. Not remotely. I investigated deeper. The calendar we use presently, the Gregorian one, was established in 1582. Previously, we used the Julian calendar, but even that wasn't the original system. Civilizations long before the church had mapped stellar movements with remarkable precision. They tracked solstices and lunar patterns with stone and shadow. They recognized when the sky shifted and they adapted. But the church didn't. It proclaimed time. It designated the days. It selected which celebrations would occur when. And slowly, reality drifted from ritual. One of the most startling discoveries was that Christmas falls nowhere near Jesus' actual birth date. It was selected to replace ancient pagan celebrations of winter solstice, Easter too. It mirrored spring fertility ceremonies that predated the cross. Even the weekly structure was reorganized to match biblical rhythm rather than cosmic patterns. And perhaps that would all be acceptable if the church acknowledged it. But instead, they presented it as absolute, as divine timing, as if God himself sketched the calendar with perfect precision. I began questioning whether time itself had been rewritten. What else had been adjusted to fit the story? Some argue it doesn't matter. Those dates are merely symbols, that significance outweighs accuracy. But when the stars above you no longer correspond to the narrative you're told, something fractures, a fissure opens, and through that crack, questions pour in. If the church could reshape time, what prevented it from reshaping history or memory or even truth? That night, I stepped outside and gazed upward. The sky was crystal clear. Stars twinkled above like silent observers. They didn't care what date we assigned. They told a different tale, one etched in light and quietude, one the church attempted to duplicate but never quite matched. And in that gap between heaven and custom, I realized the stars were accurate. We were the ones who had strayed. There's a corridor deep within the Vatican that rarely sees footsteps. No visitors, no photography, just quietude and rows of filing cabinets extending further than they should. I was assisting an elderly archivist with document organisation one afternoon, and when he left to answer a phone call, I was instructed to remain in one chamber. But curiosity doesn't follow commands. I wandered slightly, just a few paces. That's when I spotted the cabinet. It wasn't secured. I pulled it open and discovered files labelled with saint names I'd never encountered. Saint Minulphus, Saint Labrada, Saint Sicarius of Brantome. They were documented in precise Vatican typography. But something seemed off. I browsed through the pages. Most lacked birth dates. Some didn't even include locations, just brief descriptions of miracles, visions, martyrdoms. Tales that resembled legends more than actual lives. One folder simply stated, "no longer acknowledged." That phrase chilled me. It was as if someone had quietly eliminated them not through fire or violence, but through paperwork. When the archivist returned, I casually inquired about one of the saints. He stared at me briefly, then smiled and said, "Not all saints remain saints. Sometimes narratives collapse. Sometimes evidence disappears or never existed initially." That response disturbed me. I began researching deeper into the official canon, the recognized saints, thousands of names. But when I attempted to trace some of their histories, I encountered dead ends. Churches dedicated to people who might never have existed, statues of saints with no historical documentation, miracles attributed to names that first appeared in documents centuries after they allegedly died. At first I thought perhaps it was just inadequate record keeping. Ancient history is complicated, but then I discovered internal communications from the 1960s during a massive review called The Reform of Roman Martyrology. Dozens of saints were quietly removed or downgraded. Some were labelled as pious legends, others were suspected to be fictional. The Church never announced it prominently. It simply occurred. That's when it struck me. Sainthood wasn't just about faith, it was also about authority. Stories of saints were used to teach morals, to inspire reverence, to shape conduct. And if those stories needed modification or removal to fit the narrative, they were. But what about the people who prayed to them for generations? The communities built around their relics, the children named after them? What happens when your protector is declared imaginary? It made me question how many other names had been created or erased without anyone knowing. How much of our history was founded on figures that only existed on parchment and in sermons? The Church didn't need to burn books when it could just close the file and continue. And sometimes the most dangerous stories aren't the ones that get shared. They're the ones that vanish quietly, with nobody left to ask why. That day I realised the saints weren't just holy. They were edited. And in the margins of those edits, a different history was concealed. The first time I encountered the chained books, I assumed it was for conservation. Aged leather bindings, heavy iron clasps, thick chains bolted to stone desks. But then I noticed something unusual. These weren't books people were meant to read. They were books intended to remain stationary, to stay sealed. And the language within wasn't meant for everyone. It was Latin, but not the kind we studied in seminary. This Latin was more ancient, convoluted, almost as if it had been rewritten to conceal more than it revealed. There was one manuscript I recall distinctly. It appeared like a collection of parables initially, but the wording was dense, unnecessarily complex. Instead of saying God is light, it said something like, "Divine illumination is manifested through metaphysical emanation." That sounds scholarly, but it's designed to confuse, to make the meaning so difficult that only trained priests could understand it or believe they could. I asked my mentor why the Church didn't simply translate everything into common language. His response was, "Not everyone can handle the truth." He said it seriously, as if protecting the faithful from knowledge was sacred, as if truth required filtering. That's when I began recognizing the pattern. Ancient texts would be discovered in Greek or Aramaic, clear, powerful, sometimes even beautiful. But when they were copied into Latin, everything transformed, meaning shifted, words were inserted, some portions were omitted entirely, and the Latin versions became the official ones. The ones taught, preached, canonized. It wasn't just a translation, it was a metamorphosis. One day I found an early version of a gospel alongside its Latin counterpart. The original said, "The kingdom of God is within you." The Latin version rephrased, "The kingdom of God is not for all to comprehend." That single change reverses the entire meaning. One empowers the other, restricts. I began to understand that the real power of the Church wasn't in the structures or the wealth. It was in the language, the words we were permitted to hear and the ones that were buried in layers of linguistics and ceremony. In the early centuries, there were hundreds of Christian texts, letters, visions, teachings, not all harmonized with each other. Some spoke of reincarnation, others of celestial bodies and temporal cycles. Some even hinted at technology far beyond their era. But the Church selected which ones to translate, which ones to promote, and which ones to secure in chains. The deeper I delved into those archives, the more I realized that language itself had become a guardian, a method to keep the masses compliant. If you can't read the regulations, you can't challenge them. It's not that the truth was eliminated. It was encrypted, hidden in plain sight, wrapped in Latin. Few could read, and even fewer could truly comprehend. And those chains weren't just metal. They were silence. They were fear. And they were obedience disguised as devotion. They taught us that the Dark Ages were simply a period when everything collapsed. After Rome fell, the world forgot how to reason, how to construct, how to aspire. People stopped reading, science disappeared, progress was suspended. But what if that narrative isn't accurate? What if it wasn't just darkness by chance? What if it was darkness by intention? That concept hit me late one evening while reading an old lecture transcript buried deep in the Vatican archive. It wasn't even classified, just overlooked. The professor had argued that the early Middle Ages weren't as primitive as we're told. He said people didn't just lose knowledge, they were prevented from accessing it. Initially, I thought he was overstating, but then I examined the records and the gaps were enormous. For nearly 300 years, we have almost no original writings, no confirmed inventions, no clear history. As if time just faded, that's when I discovered the theory nobody likes to discuss. The phantom time hypothesis. It proposes that entire centuries may have been added or removed from history, that rulers and popes collaborated to rewrite timelines, to conceal things, or to grant themselves more authority. It sounds absurd until you realize how much of our calendar was established by popes, how many dates were altered without evidence, how many documents we depend on are copies of copies of copies. But even if time wasn't fabricated as that theory suggests, one thing is certain: the Church controlled what endured. Books that challenged doctrine were burned. Scholars who questioned too much were silenced. Entire libraries were destroyed in the name of purification, and the few locations that still contained ancient knowledge were converted into monasteries where only monks could read. The common person wasn't permitted to own scripture, or to study astronomy, or to ask where certain concepts even originated. Knowledge became a privilege, and ignorance became piety. Some inventions we think were developed in the Renaissance had already existed centuries earlier, but they were forgotten or buried. Glass, lenses, advanced maps, mechanical devices all vanished and then suddenly rediscovered as if they materialized from nothing. But they didn't. They had been suppressed, hidden in vaults, or destroyed to maintain control. The more I studied, the more I realized that the so-called Dark Ages weren't dark because of chaos. They were dark because someone dimmed the lights. When truth threatens power, it becomes perilous. And in those centuries, when the Church was growing stronger than any monarch or emperor, it determined what was sacred and what was sinful, what was remembered and what was erased. It wasn't a time without knowledge. It was a time without access. And that's the real danger of forgetting. Not that things are lost, but that they are concealed on purpose, in the name of order. And once you recognize that pattern, it's hard to ignore it, because then you start to wonder how much of what we call history was actually memory rewritten. They told us the Jesuits were educators, missionaries, men of scholarship and discipline. They dressed modestly, spoke quietly, and always acted as if they served a higher purpose. But beneath the public facade was something far more clandestine. There's something most priests are never told about, something I only discovered after I'd already sworn my own sacred vows. The Society of Jesus began in the 1500s, and from the start it was unlike anything else. Jesuits weren't merely priests, they were warriors, schooled in submission, tactical reasoning, and unwavering devotion. Everyone knew their fundamental promises: poverty, celibacy, and obedience. But whispered among senior clergy was a fourth pledge, one absent from religious textbooks: one taken only by select few in secret chambers. This fourth promise is straightforward in language, yet enormous in significance. It's a pledge of direct allegiance to the Pope, not merely in religious affairs, but in assignments, in governance, in secrecy. Those who swear it vow to travel wherever the Pope directs them to accomplish whatever is demanded. No inquiries, no delay, and their assignments rarely appear in official records. I once spoke with a Jesuit who had operated across multiple nations, always using false identities. He claimed his calling was religious, but when I questioned further, he offered an odd grin and said, "Divine combat assumes various shapes." Then he turned away, as though he'd revealed too much. The Jesuit hierarchy doesn't stop with the Pope. It flows through the Superior General, the figure known as the Black Pope. Not for his race, but for his vestments, his position, his authority. While the Pope stands publicly, blessing multitudes and greeting crowds from platforms, the Black Pope works from darkness. Few recognize his identity. Even fewer grasp his influence. He controls thousands of Jesuits worldwide, their institutions, their campaigns, their connections, and while they teach order and faith, they also collect information. They shape governance. They occupy spaces where legislation is crafted and conflicts are designed, always silent, always watching. The fourth pledge connects them not only to God, but to a hidden system of authority. And once sworn, there's no escape. You don't discuss your actions, you don't challenge your instructions, you drift like a phantom through world systems, creating no evidence, and if you resist, you vanish. Many claim this is mere folklore, that Jesuits are simply teachers and faithful servants. But I've examined the papers, I've studied the hidden protocols, I've encountered men who were never identified by their true names. The Church conceals many truths, but Jesuits don't merely protect secrets, they implement them. And the fourth pledge is the mechanism that secures everything. Not every warrior wears mail, and not every battle is fought with blades. Some are conducted in silence, through documents, through murmurs, through loyalty so profound it becomes unseen. There's a chamber hidden beneath Vatican City that few ever mention. No coloured glass, no gilded decoration, just bare stone walls and heavy wooden barriers. They don't label it a courtroom, they name it a tribunal, but it's unlike any court you've witnessed. There's no panel, no audience, just a desk, a seat, and several men in dark robes who pose questions and determine outcomes. I attended only once, as a witness, a silent guest to something ancient and concealed. They labelled it a doctrinal examination, but the title was merely a facade. What it truly was a hearing. Not for lawbreakers, but for intellectuals, for skeptics, for those who dared propose that reality might differ from church claims. The individual being interrogated was a clergyman, elderly, gaunt, with gentle features. His sole offence was composing a document proposing that Genesis might be symbolic, that creation could have occurred in stages across ages, that knowledge and belief didn't need to conflict. He didn't preach this, he didn't distribute it, he merely shared it with fellow academics, and one had betrayed him. The interrogation was harsh, calculated, meant to ensnare. Did he accept the Bible as absolute fact? Did he reject divine human creation? Did he surrender to church authority regarding life's origins? He responded cautiously, respectfully, but it was meaningless. The chamber had already decided. He was declared guilty of doctrinal error, not heresy. They avoid that term now, but the consequence felt identical. He was muted, banned from instruction. His research was seized. His standing was quietly destroyed. No flames, no shackles, just silent elimination. And he would never be heard from again. Later, I discovered ancient heresy records stored in a filing cabinet marked with faded Latin names I knew. Bruno executed for proposing stars were distant suns. Galileo suppressed for claiming Earth moved. Even obscure figures, scholars, physicians, prophets, all penalized for speaking prematurely or perceiving too clearly. The Church didn't merely resist knowledge, it dreaded it, not because it challenged God, but because it challenged authority. Each breakthrough shifted power's center. Each theory questioned the notion that only the Church possessed truth's keys. Some files contained confession transcripts, some obtained through coercion, some through torture. They were emotionless, methodical, and conclusive. Once marked a heretic, your destiny was sealed, and centuries afterward, many of their concepts would prove correct. What frightened me most wasn't the history. It was how readily those systems still functioned. The ceremonies, the silence, the discreet hearings in abandoned rooms. Not every cage has metal bars. Some are constructed with regulations and terror, and the assurance that if you pose the wrong inquiry, you'll never pose another. It began with a basic task. I was arranging ancient papal documents for a senior keeper. Birth records, death records, and official proclamation blessings. It should have been standard, just entries on paper. But something seemed wrong. Certain names existed in one volume, but were absent in another. Some popes had no history, no background, no documentation, just a title and a name, as though they had materialized from nowhere and disappeared similarly. Initially, I assumed it was careless documentation. After all, we handled centuries of handwritten manuscripts. Errors occur. But the further I investigated, the more peculiar it became. One identity would show 3 separate death dates. Another had wonders credited to him, but no texts, no currency, no evidence he ever lived. Yet the Church had recognized him as legitimate pope for over a century. I discovered one particularly odd instance. A pope who allegedly reigned for 10 days, then was secretly interred. No explanation provided, no specifics, just a short reference in one record and silence everywhere else. No grave, no image, no evidence. And yet his identity was repeated in official Vatican records, as if that validated his existence. It was like following phantoms. I mentioned it to a co-worker. He whispered not to investigate too deeply, that sometimes identities are inserted to maintain chronological order, to bridge voids, to ease power transitions. Particularly during early centuries when politics and religion were so intertwined you couldn't distinguish them. But these weren't merely voids. These were complete existences, fabricated to preserve the framework. I began examining alternative accounts, works by researchers who had observed identical patterns. They termed them phantom popes, fictional popes. Characters who existed solely in documentation but left no worldly impact. In certain instances, there were even arguments about whether specific popes were actually identical individuals using different identities. And then there was the curious matter of the first female pope, Pope Joan. A tale rejected by the Church, but whispered throughout Europe. Some said she ruled while disguised as male. Others insisted she was a cautionary tale, a story to frighten or mislead. But regardless, her narrative indicated one reality, that papal records were not as perfect as claimed. In a faith founded on tradition, the papal succession is holy. It's meant to be the continuous line from St. Peter to present, a divine chain of legitimacy. But when you discover weak connections or connections that never existed, the entire chain starts to shake. The reality is, popes were mortal, selected by humans, not divine beings. And sometimes their names were recorded for politics, for influence, or simply to hide a missing period. I once believed papal records were history, etched in marble. Now I understand they're more like writing on liquid, and certain names were never genuine, just reverberations intended to maintain the fantasy. It was another peaceful morning in the archive, where the only noise is turning ancient pages and footstep echoes on stone. I had been tasked with organising a pile of unlabelled materials. Most were innocent sermons, papal letter drafts, even old accounting records. But near the end I discovered something unusual. No marking, no stamp, just a weathered envelope bearing a single mark pressed into wax. Not the cross, not the papal emblem. Something more ancient, something I'd never encountered. Inside was a paper written in flawless Latin, but in a manner that seemed hurried and almost desperate. The script changed midway through, as if multiple people had contributed. The opening pages were bewildering passages about star science, chronologies and cosmic arrangements. But then the mood transformed. It began discussing a readjustment of time itself. Dates shifted, incidents reassigned, centuries mixed. It named popes and rulers who were repositioned in the timeline, as if history were a game board being reorganized in private. Some occurrences had been repeated under alternate names in different areas. Others were entirely invented to mask long periods of emptiness. They described it as essential for church stability, a revision for believers. My hands began trembling as I read. One segment explained how specific papers were to be modified before public archive placement, while originals were to be locked in the secret chamber. It included a catalogue of the modified papers with annotations about alterations, dates, identities, places, everything, but the most disturbing part appeared near the conclusion. A section in crimson ink cautioned that if the reality ever emerged, it would destroy not only church history but Western civilization's foundation. The concept of advancement, royal legitimacy, even scientific and astronomical credibility, it stated most would never accept it regardless, that the deception was too powerful, too deeply embedded in culture, learning and memory. I was uncertain how to proceed. I could act as if I hadn't discovered it. I could report it and watch it disappear again into storage. But something within me broke. I considered students studying history from carefully edited textbooks, about people building their faith around timelines adjusted like stage directions. I thought about everything I'd already witnessed. The restricted knowledge, the phantom popes, the absent saints. This was the final revelation. I departed the archive that day and never came back. I didn't gather belongings, I didn't offer farewells, I simply left. Because once you observe the design behind the illusion, you can't return to pretending it's authentic. And perhaps that's their reason for hiding it. Not because the truth is too horrifying, but because once you perceive it, you begin questioning everything. And that's their greatest fear, a world filled with people who demand answers. History should be a sequence of occurrences. One year follows the next, like steps through time. But what if some of those steps were fabricated? What if complete centuries were deliberately inserted? That notion sounds impossible until you examine the flaws closely. Once you notice them, there's no going back. They're calling it the phantom time theory. This idea suggests that roughly 3 centuries of our recorded history simply never occurred, particularly the years spanning from about 614 to 911 AD. This missing period encompasses countless documented events and leaders, including the early formation of the Holy Roman Empire. Yet according to this hypothesis, these years were fabricated to transform fiction into accepted fact. Central to this conspiracy stand 2 figures, Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II. Otto wielded tremendous influence across medieval Europe, driven, intelligent, and consumed by Rome's glorious heritage. His ambition wasn't merely to reign as a monarch, but to command as a true Roman Caesar. Yet he faced a crucial obstacle. His era didn't align with such grandiose aspirations. So alongside Pope Sylvester, they supposedly devised a plan to manipulate the timeline, advance the calendar forward, fabricate several centuries, create the illusion that Otto governed in the year 1000, a meaningful number, a sacred number, a number that transformed his rule into something destined, magnificent, divinely chosen. This scheme transcended mere vanity. It concerned legitimacy itself. If Otto could connect himself to Roman grandeur while claiming divine timing, he would transcend ordinary kingship. He would become legendary. Pope Sylvester was no conventional pontiff. Before assuming religious robes, he excelled as a scholar, mathematician, and according to whispered rumours, perhaps a sorcerer. He mastered astronomy, calendrical systems, numerical calculations. He possessed the knowledge to alter the framework without detection. During that period, literacy was rare. People didn't possess personal calendars. Time was announced by ecclesiastical authority through bells and religious observances. So, when leaders declared it was now the year 1000, the population accepted it. History then restructured itself around this deception. Yet evidence of this forgery persists, if you examine carefully. Archaeological researchers have observed unusually few authentic artifacts from this time frame. Architectural progress virtually stagnated. Documentation is scarcer than expected. It resembles a period where time decelerated or was populated with recycled narratives. Even ancient manuscripts seem to duplicate themselves. Identical conflicts, different characters, same monarchs in various locations, as though someone duplicated old chronicles to manufacture new chapters. If this hypothesis holds truth, then what we term the Dark Ages might represent a meticulously constructed deception. A theatrical production authored by individuals seeking to dictate how future generations would interpret the past. The Church positioned itself at this conspiracy's heart, not merely documenting time, but reconstructing it, one entry at a time. Once you recognize these chronological gaps, history stops feeling authentic. It resembles a screenplay. Someone long ago determined how the narrative should unfold. Celestial bodies don't deceive. They ascend and descend with accuracy no empire can counterfeit. Long before optical instruments or star charts, civilizations utilize the heavens to measure time for agriculture, navigation, remembrance. When the Church began rewriting chronicles, the stars became silent adversaries. Because regardless of how many documents you alter, the sky maintains flawless records. I initially encountered the concept of astrochronology in an obscure library section. It appeared in a weathered journal abandoned by a travelling researcher. This discipline involves using stellar observations to verify historical dates. Phenomena like eclipses and comets follow predictable patterns. We can calculate them retrospectively using mathematics to determine their exact occurrence. Therefore, if an ancient document claims a lunar eclipse occurred during a king's coronation, we can verify that. When discrepancies arise, something is amiss. The difficulty is that numerous church-recorded dates don't align. Several historians attempted to raise concerns initially quietly, then more boldly. They employed astronomical evidence to demonstrate that significant events may have been misplaced chronologically, that certain popes and emperors might have coexisted despite historical claims of generational separation. These weren't minor inconsistencies. These represented fundamental fractures in our calendrical foundation. Yet whenever someone approached the truth, they faced resistance. I distinctly recall one astronomer, a brilliant individual from Eastern Europe. He had constructed a computerized celestial model spanning 2 millennia. He began cross-referencing it with medieval documents and discovered numerous contradictions. He delivered a presentation in a modest lecture hall, then weeks later disappeared from academic circles. Nobody knows what occurred. His research was removed from archives. His documentation was erased. Even his identity began vanishing from records. Another case involved a clergyman who studied ancient star maps discovered in Egyptian sanctuaries. He believed they revealed a completely different temporal narrative, one where events we consider medieval might have occurred much earlier or never happened at all. He attempted to present his discoveries to the Vatican's Historical Council. They declared it blasphemous and stripped his accreditation. The Church's official position has consistently maintained that faith and science can harmonize, but only when science doesn't challenge faith's chronology. The moment stellar evidence begins rewriting the narrative, silence descends, like a theatre curtain. Some claim the Gregorian calendar reform was merely a correction, a technical adjustment. But what if it also served as a reset mechanism, a method to conceal evidence that time had been manipulated? The stars continue their vigil above, observing, waiting. They possess the authentic account. They've witnessed every night pass without forgetting a single moment. Yet those who feared the stars feared something deeper. That truth requires no pulpit. It simply needs illumination. And the heavens have never ceased their radiance. Unable to silence the stars, they silenced those who interpreted them. Deep within the Vatican exists a chamber that carries the scent of aged parchment, leather, and concealed knowledge. It isn't the archive most discuss. It's more ancient, quieter, and harder to locate. You won't find it on official blueprints, which seems peculiar because this room contains countless maps. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, rolled up, secured in compartments, or displayed under protective glass, maps that contradict our education. I gained access only once under rigid supervision. My guide spoke little, merely gestured and nodded. I was instructed to observe, but not document, not handle anything, not pose questions. Initially, I noticed coastlines that no longer exist, islands depicted in ocean areas, now empty. Mountain systems positioned where flat terrain should be. Entire continents incorrectly shaped. Some charts showed Antarctica ice-free, featuring rivers and vegetation. Others contained markings across the Atlantic, resembling cities, places with unfamiliar names, locations officially never established. One map bore a Latin inscription in the margin. My later translation read, "Beware the vanished territories." I observed charts, including civilizations we're taught never interacted, trade passages crossing impossible distances, temples marked in regions still unexplored today. The more I examined, the clearer it became these weren't artistic errors. They were glimpses into an Earth version we're no longer permitted to believe existed. Several maps were reproductions of even older charts. You could discern the ink layers where different scribes attempted to erase or modify certain designations. Yet beneath the corrections, truth remained visible, waiting. One particular chart haunts my memory, a globe sketch from the early 1500s. It depicted both American continents long before Columbus. Not as blank territories, but labelled with village names, waterways, even pyramid-like symbols. When I indicated it, the archivist shook his head, stating, "That one remains classified." Why would the Church preserve maps contradicting its historical version? Why secure them rather than displaying them publicly? Because maps represent danger. They reveal not only your location, but your origins. If sufficient people examine the old charts, they might question why the new ones misrepresent reality. Cartography isn't merely scientific, it's political. Whoever controls the maps controls the narrative, boundaries, names, the memory of what existed. The Vatican doesn't only protect theology, it protects geography. Within those forgotten drawers lie pathways to places we've been told never existed, were destroyed, or worse, still exist but remain deliberately hidden. Maps don't forget. They simply await interpretation. Sometimes the most frightening thing isn't becoming lost. It's discovering you were never where you believed you were. There's an unusual pattern embedded in our accepted narratives. The deeper you investigate history, the more it seems certain identities were exchanged. Innovators replaced with saints, experiments rewritten as miracles, knowledge transformed into mythology, as if the past was edited, not erased, simply rebranded. I first detected this while researching records from an early monastery renowned for healing. The scrolls described people recovering from fatal illnesses, bones healing instantly, fevers broken through touch. The local bishop attributed this to saintly intervention. Yet, in the margins, someone had added notes in different ink. Components, temperatures, methods. It read more like medical documentation than divine occurrence. Gradually, I discovered similar accounts. A man who could purify water using mineral powders, canonized posthumously as a saint. His journals discussed chemistry. A woman who taught villagers celestial navigation, later transformed into a mystical figure who simply followed heavenly signs. Her original charts disappeared. Only prayers survived. It represented a deliberate transition, a conscious decision to credit heaven rather than human ingenuity. When I questioned a senior priest about this, he smiled with sadness. He explained the church didn't despise knowledge. It feared what happened when understanding surpassed faith. People begin questioning why. When they stop requiring blessings, they stop needing those who provide them. Rather than completely prohibiting ideas, they gave them new forms, clothed science in religious garments, placed halos on the curious, transformed instruments into relics. A mechanism becomes a saint's wheel, a telescope becomes heaven's eye, a book becomes a vision. One file recounted a young man who invented a device measuring rainfall and predicting floods. He faced heresy charges, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. Local authorities feared it would replace prayer, that people would trust machinery over miracles. After his death, the church quietly canonized him, calling his invention a divine gift. The device was concealed, the story altered. This transcended power struggles. This concerned memory control. By shaping how people remember the past, you determine how they envision the future. A reality where progress stems from prayer, not experimentation. Where innovation is divine, not dangerous. We imagine saints as holy individuals who radiated virtue. Perhaps some were simply brilliant thinkers, inventors, healers, nature observers, silenced in life and venerated in death. Truth is, the distinction between miracle and invention is narrower than we're taught. Sometimes the greatest miracle is that knowledge survived at all. They didn't eliminate the scientists. They transformed them into saints, because it's simpler to worship what you don't comprehend than admit someone solved it before you. They appeared harmless, heads bowed in prayer, robes trailing across stone floors, hands stained with ink from transcribing scriptures. Medieval monks were perceived as peaceful, dedicated, and silent. What nobody mentions is that some were also intelligence agents. Monasteries weren't merely worship centres, they functioned as information networks in a world where literacy was rare. Monks held the keys to knowledge. With those keys came influence, the type of influence that didn't require weapons or armies, just silence and ink. Every monastery contained a scriptorium, a chamber where texts were hand-copied. Yet not every text was copied accurately. I discovered documents with entire paragraphs deleted and complete pages substituted. One monk confessed in an old letter that he was commanded to eliminate certain names from history, rewrite events, alter dates, not because they were false, but because they didn't serve the church's truth version. Monks also travelled quietly under the pretense of pilgrimage or service. They returned with more than prayers. They brought intelligence, court gossip, reports of unusual teachings, warnings about heretics. They served as the church's surveillance network across the continent, long before governments possessed comparable intelligence systems. If a village was constructing a strange device or a scholar was teaching non-conforming ideas, monks would likely hear first. Then information would travel up the hierarchy, sometimes resulting in a quiet visit from higher clergy, sometimes a public trial, sometimes records simply vanished. One disturbing file described a coastal monastery that received a book from a traveller, a text containing knowledge about tides, wind patterns, and lunar movements. The abbot read it, praised it, then burned it. He wrote that such knowledge would lead people away from divine dependence, that it was better lost than learned. This wasn't simple censorship. This was strategic memory management. Hidden chambers existed, secret vaults beneath certain monasteries where banned texts were stored, not destroyed. Because while the public couldn't access them, the church wanted to preserve the information for potential future use. This made me reconsider everything about those quiet, candlelit halls. The chanting, prayers, gentle routines. Behind the tranquility was a surveillance network. Behind the ink was a blade. The most disturbing aspect is how effective it proved. Entire intellectual revolutions were prevented before they began. Not through violence, but through whispers, notes, missing pages. Monks weren't just preserving history, they were moulding it, controlling it, editing it. They didn't need to command armies. They commanded the past. When you control the past, you shape the future. Not every monk was a spy, but enough were to make you wonder what truly hid behind those walls, and how many truths were sealed in silence. Most visitors enter cathedrals and perceive beauty. The coloured glass, soaring ceilings, statues gazing down like silent sentinels. Yet I was trained to look deeper, not at what was displayed, but at what was concealed. Because within these stone monuments are messages carved into silence, messages the church never discussed. It began when I visited a cathedral famous for its unusual architecture. Tourists came for the bells and candles, but I kept noticing designs. Geometric forms integrated into arches, perfect proportions in window arrangements, carvings that didn't match official narratives, lions with human expressions, angels holding instruments resembling compasses, spiral symbols reflecting ancient celestial knowledge. One statue particularly captured my attention. It was positioned behind a column, barely visible unless you knew its location. It depicted a man holding an open book, but the book wasn't scripture. The text was written in a forgotten language, and his eyes were closed, as if protecting the knowledge rather than sharing it. Most cathedrals were constructed in cruciform shape, yet some had secret blueprints underneath, mazes etched into floors, measurements connected to planetary movements, builders who exceeded craftsmanship. They were mathematicians, engineers, possibly members of secret societies, individuals who encoded concepts that would have been burned if spoken openly. Even cathedral positioning told stories aligned with solstices, eclipses, star patterns, a form of stone astronomy integrated into the building's structure. Why would a house of God need stellar alignment? Unless the builders possessed knowledge they weren't permitted to express. I remember one carving that disturbed my sleep for days. It showed a tower under construction. Midway up, it transformed into a tree. The branches encircled a sphere, and the sphere bore no cross on top. Instead, it displayed a compass. Below the carving, someone had etched the words, "Seek truth in silence." When I mentioned these discoveries to older priests, they dismissed them. Artistic preferences, they claimed. Faith symbols, they insisted. Yet I could read it in their expressions. They understood. Perhaps not the complete truth, but enough to fear it. The more I explored, the more it felt like builders were attempting to leave warnings, or perhaps guides, not to places, but to concepts, hidden truths embedded in stone to outlast fire, censorship, and time. Cathedrals were meant to educate the illiterate. Yet they didn't only teach scripture. They whispered secrets to those who understood how to listen. Not every message concerned God. Some addressed the stars, knowledge, power. The church attempted to control words, but stone doesn't burn. When you begin interpreting these carvings not as decoration but as defiance, you start wondering how much of our history was carved in rebellion directly beneath faith's gaze. Europe is haunted not by spirits or demons but by machinery, remnants of inventions that shouldn't exist, ruins of systems nobody can explain, instruments buried in dust that seem too advanced for their supposed era. They label them anomalies. I call them mechanical phantoms. It began with an abandoned monastery garden, overgrown and forgotten. Beneath the roots lay a network of pipes and channels, more sophisticated than anything in medieval textbooks. It wasn't merely a well or simple aqueduct. It filtered water, cooled air, and captured condensation, almost like ancient climate control. Yet nobody knew who constructed it. Current monks claimed it had always existed. Then I found sketches in banned manuscript margins, illustrations of rotating gears, winding cranks, and moving components. One resembled a mechanical timepiece. Another appeared like a loom that could program designs independently. The manuscripts date nearly 3 centuries before such machines were supposed to exist. Later, I visited a French church with an unusual bell system. It chimed every hour with perfect precision. Yet there were no ropes, nobody pulling. When I asked about its operation, the caretaker shrugged and said it had been broken for decades. When I investigated secretly, I found a wooden mechanism hidden behind a wall. Weighted gears, levers. It had once powered itself, using water from a nearby spring. Stories like this exist everywhere, if you know what to ask. Villagers who speak of ancient mills that could process grain without human contact. Bridges made of stone so precisely carved, they remain uneroded. Locks so exact, they require keys no blacksmith can duplicate. Tools buried with craftsmen containing alloys not found in that region until centuries later. Some claim these were flukes, fortunate inventions by geniuses lost to time. Yet too many were hidden, buried, destroyed, or worse, attributed to divine miracles. One document described a tower in Italy that once housed a machine capable of mapping stars with incredible precision. The tower burned during a religious war, but survivors described bronze and glass cogs, lenses so powerful they could spot ships on the horizon hours before arrival. The church frequently called these creations dangerous, too close to sorcery, or worse, a challenge to God. Because if humanity could construct wonders without divine permission, what did that suggest about church authority? So they silenced the machines, not by destroying them, but by forgetting them, burying them beneath new structures, removing their inventors from memory, calling their creations myths. Yet the phantoms remain, in cellars, in ruins, in texts nobody reads anymore. They are echoes of a Europe far more ingenious than we've been told, a continent that may have once hummed with gears and whispered with steam long before the industrial era ever began. We didn't advance forward, we were forced backward, and the machines left behind are the evidence. The first time I entered a church-run classroom, I thought I was stepping into a place of illumination, a room designed for learning truth, wisdom, answers. Yet, as years passed, I realised it wasn't a place to explore. It was a place to forget. Not forget in the ordinary sense, not like misplacing your keys or losing a book. This was something deeper, intentional, a kind of quiet erasure that operated from within. The lessons remained constant. Scripture memorization, rigid timelines, lists of saints and sinners. Questions were permitted, but only the appropriate kind. When you wondered aloud why the Creator made identical celestial bodies, they celebrated your inquiry. When you dared ask why those same stars failed to align with ecclesiastical dates, they issued warnings. I recall one instance when I raised my hand, questioning why Scripture omitted reference to ancient empires we knew had existed. My instructor's expression darkened. He informed me that certain matters were beyond questioning. The lesson continued without me. That moment marked the start of enforced quietude. Every text contained absent chapters. Every chronology harboured missing decades. Charts were oversimplified. Celebrated philosophers were all cut from the same cloth. Augustine, Aquinas, select approved poets, while the forbidden voices remained unspoken. No reference to stargazers, architects, or revolutionaries. The issue wasn't merely their curriculum. The problem lay in their methodology. Memorization replaced discovery, recital took precedence over logic, compliance brought rewards, not inquisitiveness, submission, not amazement. One classroom displayed a diagram I'll never erase from memory. It outlined the progression of transgression. At the foundation, printed in tiny script, appeared a single term: skepticism. That captured the essence entirely. Skepticism was the adversary. Not simply disbelief in the divine, but questioning anything whatsoever. Established historical markers, religious authorities, acknowledged truths. Challenge the past and you challenge the current order. Challenge the present and you drift from redemption. Several elderly monastics later admitted to me they harboured similar uncertainties in their younger days. Yet they suppressed them because inquiries led to reassignment, or censorship, or banishment to monasteries so isolated that no soul would encounter you again. I discovered concealed diaries in one deserted academy, wedged behind masonry in the structure, sheets covered with student inquiries. What truly befell Hypatia? Why don't celestial patterns correspond to religious observances? Why do certain holy figures never appear in earlier writings? Why were particular innovations never discussed? Those inquiries lacked responses, yet they contained something else noted in the margin by another pen. Perhaps a cleric, perhaps a pupil, perhaps someone who recognized reality. It stated, "This institution doesn't educate, it eliminates." That's when comprehension dawned. The Church didn't merely revise history within volumes. It rewrote consciousness itself, season after season, era after era, until nobody recalled what had disappeared. The Academy of Erasure wasn't folklore, it existed. Most chilling of all, it continues to exist. Duration appears straightforward. Hours, weeks, decades. Each follows its predecessor like tracks in powder. Yet what if those tracks were rearranged? What if the timeline we rely upon was constructed not to measure duration, but to dominate it? The Vatican didn't simply mould belief, it moulded the chronometer. Most individuals don't contemplate schedules, we employ them without hesitation. Yet the transition from Julian to Gregorian dating was beyond merely fixing leap calculations. It constituted a restart, a revision, a silent elimination of periods. Perhaps much more. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII proclaimed the revised calendar. Their explanation claimed Easter had shifted excessively from the vernal equinox. Therefore they corrected it. 10 complete days disappeared. One morning brought October 4th. The following morning became October 15th. Simply erased. Citizens accepted it. They received assurance it served precision. Yet consider what else might be altered when nobody challenges missing time. 10 periods this season, perhaps 100 during the coming century, perhaps whole centuries. Eras rewritten and locked in storage. During my examination of ancient papers, I detected peculiar arrangements, incidents that appeared chronologically inconsistent, correspondence mentioning monarchs who shouldn't have coexisted. Climate documentation that contradicted celestial information. The heavens seemed to narrate one account, while the Church presented another entirely. Certain academics murmur regarding the phantom era theory, the concept that centuries were inserted into dating, that rulers and pontiffs wrote themselves into chronicles, that our current year isn't what we believe. One hypothesis suggests Otto III and Pope Sylvester II conspired to advance the calendar, positioning themselves within the year 1000. A symbolic gesture to claim authority at a millennial turning that never truly occurred. The deeper I investigated, the more contradictions emerged. Voids in documented records, redundancies, complete lifespans absent from official collections. Calendars employed across European regions that failed to correspond. Always the identical reaction from church chroniclers. Have faith in us, it served your benefit. Yet why would religion need to modify time? Because duration equals authority. Control when events occurred and you control significance. You can render certain narratives appear timeless and unquestionable. You can make others disappear completely. Master the calendar and you master recollection. When I presented this to a retired bishop, He didn't refute it. He simply declared, "The Church has consistently acted as required to safeguard truth." Then he grinned and mentioned that occasionally truth demands sacrifice. I departed that discussion feeling chilled, not from fear of missing periods, but because I began recognizing how extensively the deception reached not merely of faith, but of existence itself. Duration is our most precious shared possession, and the Vatican transformed it into an instrument for revising chronicles and concealing what they preferred the world to forget. There's a narrative the Church repeats endlessly. A settlement facing ruin, rescued by a saint's blessing. A sculpture that sheds genuine tears. A wellspring that emerges from barren soil following prayer. They label it heavenly interference. Yet what if certain miracles originated not from paradise whatsoever? What if they were contraptions? Within one forgotten archive, I located directions to a destroyed monastery constructed within a mountainside. Its fame stemmed from tales of a fountain that never ceased flowing, even during dry spells. The liquid streamed continuously. Visitors called it a sacred source. Clergy proclaimed it divine favour. Yet when I eventually explored the remains, I discovered stone conduits carved underground and what resembled a valve arrangement. A basic yet ingenious water pressure controller. Someone designed that flow. No miracle required. Mathematics sufficed. On another occasion, I learned of a saint's statue that genuflected during worship. It was deemed evidence of celestial approval. Hundreds witnessed the occurrence. The Church declared it miraculous. Yet concealed within a maintenance record from later centuries appeared a notation. Written in Latin, it detailed internal mechanisms operated by rope and counterweight systems, hidden beyond the sanctuary. The craftsman who recorded it felt proud. He called it an engineering masterpiece, the type quietly dismantled once the Church revised its position on sorcery. Across Europe, I uncovered blueprints sketched in secrecy. Plans for towers that shifted with breezes, sanctuaries that illuminated when specific prayers were uttered, crucifixes that rotated toward the sun at midday. Some were brilliant deceptions. Others represented genuine innovation, hydraulic force, magnetism, light manipulation. Yet rather than honouring the genius of creators, they were classified as miracles. Subsequently, the inventors were either sanctified or erased. Power resided in the spectacle. If congregations believed only saints or clergy could produce such marvels, it meant the Church possessed the keys to divinity. Acknowledging that a craftsman or constructor achieved identical results using tools and expertise would indicate heaven wasn't the origin and faith would lose some of its luster. I once questioned an elderly priest regarding a revolving altar I had observed in a forgotten chapel. He merely smiled and remarked, "Sometimes the Almighty operates through skillful hands." Yet his manner was cautious, as though he understood it exceeded that, but preferred not to articulate it. Miracles generated fear and reverence. Machines prompted inquiries, and inquiries posed threats. Therefore, repeatedly, the Church selected the miracle. It concealed the blueprints and elevated the saints. It transformed engineers into myths and innovations into blessings. And humanity forgot that behind numerous sacred instances were cables, mechanisms, pulleys, and intellects far advanced beyond their era. Not every miracle was deception, yet not every miracle was divine either. Some were merely misinterpreted science clothed in vestments and crowned with glory. Individuals discussed the Renaissance as though it were lightning, a sudden explosion of brilliance. Following centuries of obscurity, creativity bloomed. Learning returned. Concepts burst like pyrotechnics. Yet what if it wasn't spontaneous whatsoever? What if the Renaissance was orchestrated? Not a revelation, but a liberation. A precisely timed awakening written by those who had been concealing the wisdom throughout. During my studies within the Vatican, I witnessed how numerous texts remained imprisoned. Ancient writings from Greece, Egypt, Persia, even vanished civilizations nobody dared acknowledge. These weren't secured because they were malevolent. They were secured because they held power. They discussed healing, construction, star study and mathematics far exceeding what the church wanted people to understand at that moment. Then, gradually, around the 1040s, that wisdom began resurfacing, yet not simultaneously, deliberately, in phases, a parchment here, a document there, reproduced, interpreted and delivered to reliable scholars. Artists began creating with mysterious symbols. Scientists resumed sky observation. Nothing about it seemed accidental. It was like someone cracked open a vault just wide enough to release a handful of concepts, sufficient to strike the spark but not enough to tear down everything around us. I discovered correspondence between church officials and early intellectuals. They discussed controlling the surge of new thinking, ensuring discoveries got credited to reliable figures the church could still claim to shepherd through this awakening. They labelled it divine providence, but it was calculated planning. The Renaissance masters themselves played their scripted roles. Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael. They weren't simply creating paintings, they were part of the inner circle. Their masterpieces concealed mathematical principles and ancient symbols pointing toward forbidden knowledge systems. Their creations worked like riddles, reality wrapped in splendor. A mural I examined contained a hidden spiral woven into cloud formations. That spiral perfectly matched the design of a banned manuscript I glimpsed once behind protective glass. A text that charted celestial bodies using methods no one should have possessed for generations afterward. Pure chance? Highly unlikely. The Renaissance offered humanity an appearance of advancement, but that progress came with strings attached. New findings required ecclesiastical blessing. Publications needed filtering. Concepts deemed too threatening got postponed or eliminated entirely. Those who pushed boundaries too aggressively met swift consequences. Galileo experienced this reality personally, celebrated one moment, locked away the next. Not for being incorrect, but for speaking truth before the timing suited their plans. The deeper I dug, the more convinced I became that antiquity had never truly vanished. It had been archived, secured, then returned when society was desperate enough to embrace it without questioning its origins. The Renaissance represented a magnificent chapter in human development, but magnificence can serve as camouflage. Behind the brilliance lurked shadows, invisible forces determining what we recalled and what we abandoned. This wasn't spontaneous enlightenment, this was orchestrated revelation. The performance had been choreographed long before anyone took the stage. Some fires refuse to die in darkness. They get protected, passed quietly from guardian to guardian, spanning lifetimes. While the Vatican worked to bury forbidden knowledge, others laboured secretly to safeguard it. These weren't clergy or church leaders. They were craftsmen, astronomers, thinkers and mystics. They were the hidden custodians. Their purpose was preserving illumination. They adopted various identities: Freemasons, Rosicrucians, Knights Templar. To outsiders they appeared like social clubs or strange sects, but their symbols revealed deeper meanings: mathematical forms, sacred ratios, constellations pointing toward ancient wisdom. While the church painted saints across heavenly vaults, these brotherhoods inscribed formulas on concealed manuscripts and etched messages into stonework. I once examined a cathedral design from the 13th century covered in mysterious markings, compass patterns unrelated to religious doctrine but connected to stellar gateways, proportions that mirrored human anatomy and planetary movements. This structure wasn't constructed merely for prayer, it was designed to preserve understanding. A quiet uprising carved in granite. In a forgotten basement beneath a former abbey, I discovered a duplicate of a volume the Vatican claimed had been destroyed, an alchemical manual written in gold ink that sparkled like starlight. It described the conversion of luminosity concealed within physical matter. The priest who possessed it had written a note in the margins. They attempted to destroy this. I created another copy. Keep it moving forward. The Rosicrucians supposedly held ancient Egyptian secrets, sealed chambers, libraries buried beneath desert sands. When adventurers returned from the East during the Holy Wars, some didn't carry back religious artifacts. They brought back architectural plans, mysteries the church couldn't decipher or refuse to attempt. The Freemasons were constructors, but also philosophers. They studied Solomon's Temple not simply as biblical history, but as encrypted guidance, a blueprint. They believed truth lay hidden in design, in balance, in illumination itself. They didn't proclaim it openly, they wove it into reality, in meeting halls, in buildings, in the organisation of whole metropolitan areas. The church branded them heretical, conspiratorial, but seldom outright lied. Because fundamentally, the church understood what these societies were protecting. Not mythology, not insurrection. Collective memory. Even alchemists, dismissed as fantasists searching to transform base metals into precious ones, weren't pursuing wealth. Most sought something more ancient, recovery of buried wisdom, methods to unlock what had been sealed away. I once encountered an elderly gentleman in Portugal who claimed membership in a continuous chain of protectors. He revealed a ring bearing a symbol predating any Christian cross, a compass surrounded by flame. He explained, "We don't oppose them, we remain patient. Truth always resurfaces. It simply requires somewhere to take root." That's what these organisations represented landing zones for, abandoned knowledge. While the Vatican eliminated it, they remembered. While the Church destroyed, they preserved. They were the return of enlightenment. Though they faced persecution, suppression and dispersal, their flame never died. It simply went underground. And perhaps now, it's starting to emerge once more. It ranks among Earth's most protected spaces, not because it contains treasure or precious stones, but because it harbours something far more valuable. Memory, reality, possibly even fragments of time itself. They name it the Vatican Secret Archives, but that title misleads. It's not merely confidential, it's concealed, locked away. The world has witnessed only a tiny portion of what exists below. The entry appears unremarkable, a stone corridor, a metal barrier, an electronic scanner. But beyond that threshold stretch over 50 miles of shelving, 50 miles underground, illuminated by wavering lights and filled with documents no outsider has examined in centuries. Some written in extinct languages, some recorded in symbols, some with bindings that seem to vibrate when handled. I recall my first glimpse of the catalogue, handwritten throughout. A crimson leather volume no thicker than a standard reference book. But the listings inside didn't resemble typical publications. They read like cautions, manuscripts from before the Great Flood, forbidden testimonies, accounts from outcasts whose identities never entered historical records, technical drawings of devices sketched generations before such innovations should have existed. One entry simply stated, "Do not handle without Holy Office authorization." Contents unstable. Unstable information. Consider that concept. Words so hazardous they require isolation, not because of their nature, but because of their potential impact. Alter conviction, rewrite chronicles. Demonstrate we aren't who we believe ourselves to be. Stories circulate about correspondence from Leonardo describing flight, not as fantasy, as engineering, mechanics, aerodynamics, as though he had witnessed aircraft that wouldn't appear for 5 centuries. Whispers speak of charts depicting land masses absent from contemporary maps, navigation records tracing stars in patterns that contradict current models, timekeeping systems from societies erased by history, or something more sinister. One former custodian who vanished in the 90s claimed he encountered a scroll sealed in dark wax. Inside were markings etched in golden foil, not Latin, not Greek. Something older, a language of shapes. He reported that prolonged observation made him feel watched in return. The Church maintains the archives remain restricted to protect delicate materials, to guard truth until sharing becomes safe. But when is safe? A century? A millennium? Or never? Because if half the contents on those shelves prove authentic, everything we understand about human civilization transforms. The conflicts, faiths, innovations, chronologies, all of it. The hidden repository isn't merely a location, it's a barrier between the reality we inhabit and the one that was taken from us. The most frightening aspect isn't what it contains. It's knowing we may never gain access. Not because we lack comprehension, but because our understanding might prove too complete. There exists a version of Scripture most people never encounter, not because it's lost or damaged, but because it was intentionally buried. Pages removed, identities deleted, teachings that might have transformed everything, concealed beneath layers of terror and destruction. They branded them blasphemies, but they represented something different. An alternative perspective, a different narrative, a reality too unfiltered for the Church's empire to permit. These were the Gospels they sought to eliminate. Among the most enigmatic is the Gospel of Thomas. It reads unlike the others. No nativity account, no execution, simply teachings, words attributed directly to Jesus. But the tone differs, intimate, as though he addressed not multitudes, but seekers. One phrase resonates above others: the kingdom exists within you. That concept alone could undermine centuries of authority. If divinity resides inside you, what need exists for intermediaries? Then there's the Gospel of Mary. Not Mary the mother, but Mary Magdalene, the woman rewritten as a fallen woman to diminish her influence. But in this gospel, she becomes the one who truly grasps Jesus' message, the one he trusts, the one other disciples fear because her insight threatens their position. Through this text's lens, she wasn't merely a follower, she was an instructor. Perhaps something more. When I first found copies of these Gospels in a secured drawer deep within archives I wasn't authorized to access, I felt like I'd stumbled upon evidence of wrongdoing. The pages showed burn marks along the edges, as if someone had attempted destruction then reconsidered. The Latin classifications didn't match the actual content. It seemed they were hiding them even from themselves. Others exist as well. The Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of the Egyptians. Texts suggesting completely different versions of events. Some claim Jesus laughed during his betrayal. Others suggest he never perished at all. Some describe spiritual rebirth, not physical resurrection. All were prohibited, all were hunted. Because if people accepted these accounts, it would prove the Church's foundation wasn't constructed from stone. It was built from silence. You must wonder why. Why expend such effort erasing words? Why burn scrolls and bury libraries and alter names? If the authorized version contains truth, why fear alternatives? The answer involves control. The banned Gospels empowered individuals. They made the sacred something personal, not institutional. They transformed God from a command into a whisper. That terrified those who constructed their empire on compliance. The Gospels they tried to burn survive in pieces, in rumours, in quiet spaces between official statements. Perhaps that suffices, because once truth gets recorded, it can never be completely destroyed, only postponed, only feared, and eventually rediscovered. There was an era when questioning could cost your life. Not dangerous questions or political ones, just basic curiosity. Why do celestial bodies move? What comprises the human form? What causes lightning? In an age dominated by the Church, even wonder was perilous. It wasn't fostered, it was dreaded, because curiosity opens pathways. The Vatican spent centuries ensuring certain pathways remained closed. Picture a world where books were chained shut, where reading forbidden material meant suffering, where sketching the solar system differently could destroy your freedom. That wasn't imagination. That was Europe for hundreds of years. I remember discovering an old correspondence buried in the records. It came from a monk in the 1400s who'd been caught using magnifying glasses to study tiny creatures. The letter was brief. "They have confiscated my instruments. I am forbidden to observe God's creation without authorization." That single sentence devastated me. He wasn't challenging doctrine, he was simply trying to see more clearly, yet even that was considered rebellion. The Church claimed to defend truth, but actually it monopolized it. Scientists who uncovered things contradicting Scripture were compelled to withdraw their conclusions or face severe punishment. Galileo was forced to reject what his own observations revealed. Not because his findings were wrong, but because his timing was premature. Because the world wasn't prepared for the heavens to contradict the Bible. Philosophers too faced persecution. Men who examined the nature of existence, consciousness, temporality itself, were branded heretics. Some faced imprisonment, some faced execution, others simply disappeared. Their writings vanished, their identities erased from documentation. This wasn't solely about religion. This was about power. If people began thinking independently, exploring, questioning, they might realize the Church wasn't the exclusive source of knowledge. That possibility terrified leadership more than anything. I once handled a prohibited anatomy text. It displayed muscles, skeletal structure, and circulation. It had been duplicated secretly by students who risked everything just to understand bodily functions. Bloodstains marked the pages, not from the illustrations, from those who died protecting them. You might assume that belongs to distant history, but even today traces of that fear persist. Certain texts remain off-limits. Certain inquiries still get silenced. The battle against curiosity never completely ceased. It merely transformed. The reality is the Church was never simply fighting science. It was fighting wonder, that spark in human nature that refuses to accept simple explanations, that drive to understand. When curiosity became criminal, knowledge became forbidden cargo. History was shaped not by what we discovered, but by what we were never permitted to investigate. But questions are persistent things. You can bury them, but eventually they resurface. When they do, everything transforms. It didn't begin with violence, it began with suspicion. Subtle warnings murmured in sacred halls, glances shared across flickering chambers. A gradual spreading dread that grew not from brutality, but from its potential. That if you considered the wrong thoughts or studied the wrong materials or even imagined too far beyond accepted limits, you could face accusations not of wickedness, but of heresy. In those times, heresy was more serious than crime. It was a fissure in the flawless facade, a threat to the illusion. The Inquisition didn't target only witches or revolutionaries. It pursued intellectuals, creators, healers, stargazers, people who dared envision a reality that didn't conform to Rome's approved narrative. Their methods weren't limited to torture devices and flames. They employed silence, they wielded shame. They converted neighbours into informants, students into betrayers, families into prosecutors. I remember reading trial records of a young woman. She had asked during confession whether animals possessed souls. Just asked. The priest reported her. She was seized, interrogated, charged with harbouring unnatural thoughts. Her entire existence crumbled from a single question. That's how fragile reasoning became. Not because it was flawed, but because it posed danger. Educational institutions began emphasizing obedience over intellect. Legends replaced learning. Saints supplanted scholars. Wonder was labelled temptation. So, gradually, minds turned inward. Not from ignorance, from self-preservation. Safer to believe than to doubt. safer to repeat than to explore, safer to fear the unknown than to pursue it. Generations matured within that confinement, unaware it was confinement. That's the cruelest element. When bars are forged from tradition and locks are made from guilt, you don't test the door. You learn to sit quietly, to pray when you want to ask, to obey when you want to create. I once saw a collection of inventions designed centuries ahead of their era, mechanisms that could move entire settlements, concepts for pure water, systems for flight, for light without combustion, all sketched in secrecy, all hidden within walls behind altars because their inventors knew they would be destroyed before their devices ever functioned. The Inquisition didn't just torture bodies, it shattered imagination. It redefined what was acceptable to feel. When you train enough minds to fear their own thoughts, you don't need physical restraints anymore. The prison exists within, but thought is patient. Some people kept old ideas alive in code, in carvings, in artwork that appeared religious but carried messages only the curious could decode. The mind can be silenced, but not permanently. Each time someone remembers to ask why, that silence fractures slightly, until eventually the questions return in force. The world begins to think again, not because permission was granted, but because fear finally lost its grip. They didn't wear royal regalia. They didn't command armies. They didn't march into territories carrying banners. Yet they conquered more than empires ever achieved. They moulded minds, controlled memory, twisted history itself. To serve their vision, they were the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. Their empire wasn't built on territory, it was constructed in silence. Initially, they appeared like just another religious brotherhood, educated, disciplined, devoted. But beneath the robes and ceremonies lay something more deliberate, a plan, a structure, one that recognized the real battlefield wasn't external. It was inside the classroom, inside the courthouse, inside the mind. I remember my first encounter with the diagram, a hand-drawn chart from a dusty drawer in the archives. It didn't mark nations, it marked influence. Universities, royal advisors, publishing houses, political confessions. Every point represented a location where a Jesuit had served or still served. It resembled less a religious mission and more like a web spanning Europe. They began with education, not ordinary schools, the elite institutions. They instructed princes, taught diplomats, authored the curricula. If you studied Latin, mathematics, philosophy or theology in the 17th century, you likely learned from a Jesuit. With every lesson came something additional, subtle moulding, a limiting of possibilities. You didn't just absorb information, you learned how to think, more critically how not to. Then came the courts, not as attorneys, as confessors, spiritual counsellors to monarchs, queens and military leaders, whispering behind thrones, providing guidance in God's name, but also in policy's name. The Jesuits weren't merely men of faith, they were men of calculation. They maintained files, tracked secrets, knew who owed obligations to whom. Some historians claim they learned of battles before armies mobilized, that they could prevent wars with correspondence or initiate them with gossip. Governments paid attention. Some feared them, others embraced them, some nations banned them completely. But even banishment couldn't halt the mission. They operated covertly, adopted new identities, continued their work. Always teaching, always guiding, always observing. One document I found simply stated, "The pen surpasses the sword." It bore no signature, but I recognized it as Jesuit. Because their genuine power was never about force, it was about formation. You don't need to battle a king if you educate his heir. You don't need to burn books if you author them first. People still view the Jesuits as a religious organization, and they are. But they are also architects of thought, engineers of memory, guardians of a historical version that serves something far deeper than faith. Their empire was never loud, never ostentatious, but it was enormous. It remains here, in how schools teach, in how courts justify, in how governments speak of truth and tradition. It is a quiet empire, but silence has always been their most effective weapon. Most people consider time as something constant, a dawn, a calendar, a ticking timepiece. But what if time wasn't just something we follow, but something we're guided through? Like a corridor designed to control where we travel and what we witness. That corridor has an architect. For centuries, that architect was the church. They didn't create time, but they moulded it, curved it, sliced it, concealed portions, inserted others. All to construct a version of history that supported the story they wanted to tell. If you control the past, you control the present. If you shape the future before it arrives, you control what people believe possible. One day, in the archives, I found a small container, labelled only with a date. Inside were letters between priests and astronomers. They were attempting to synchronise the calendar with celestial movements, but not as scientists would. This wasn't about precision, it was about power. They were deciding when sacred observances should occur, not based on actual events, but on symbolism, on messaging, on control. Easter, for instance. The date shifts annually. Why? Because it's connected to a lunar calendar, the full moon following the spring equinox. That sounds poetic, but it's also strategic. It keeps the most important, vital Christian event floating, shifting, impossible to anchor to any specific historical moment. That transforms the resurrection into an emotion, not a fact. Emotions are easier to manipulate than facts. Then there's the transition from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian. Officially, it was about correcting leap years. But 10 days disappeared overnight. People awakened and it was suddenly 10 days later. Entire lifespans lost in a bureaucratic revision of time. Who orchestrated that change? Pope Gregory III. The Church didn't just modify the calendar, they rewrote reality. Prophecies too were timed strategically. Predictions of end times, messiahs, signs in the sky, all aligned to dates the Church sanctioned. If something didn't fit the official narrative, it was called heresy and erased. But if a new star appeared or a comet crossed the heavens, and it could be linked to a scriptural verse, it became a tool, a method to keep believers alert, obedient and afraid. When you master time, you master recollection, and recollection is the foundation of everything. It shapes our identity, guides our understanding of origins and destinations. Whoever controls the timepiece and the calendar and the prophecies controls your narrative. And whoever controls your narrative can convince you of almost anything. The Church assumed the role of chronometer, not merely of hours and days, but of ages and fates. They dictated when history commenced and when it would conclude. In this process, they transcended religion itself. They evolved into the scribes of time itself. And the more thoroughly you investigate, the clearer it becomes that time isn't simply flowing past. It is being narrated verse by forces older than our wildest assumptions. It's simple to enter a cathedral and perceive only magnificence, the ascending arches and coloured glass, the flawless harmony of illumination and darkness. But what if that magnificence served a deeper purpose? What if it conveyed a message? A concealed cipher etched in marble, awaiting discovery, not inscribed in language but in forms, calculations, designs. The builders understood their mission. They weren't merely constructing houses of worship, they were creating repositories of wisdom. I recall gazing upward at the dome of an ancient basilica in southern France. Something seemed amiss, not incorrect, simply too flawless. The balance, measurements, the manna sunbeams struck the altar precisely at midday on one specific day annually. It seemed intentional, not coincidental, and upon closer examination I discovered it. The recurring circles and triangles, proportions that corresponded to celestial charts. the golden helix concealed in the sanctuary's design. This transcended artistry. It was data. Sacred mathematics is the concept that particular shapes carry significance, that the cosmos itself adheres to patterns. The circle representing infinity, the triangle symbolizing harmony, the square denoting stability. These weren't merely emblems, they were instruments, and medieval builders employed them like clerics, used holy text to safeguard truths too perilous to voice openly. You understand, when language was forbidden, when volumes were destroyed, when inquisitiveness was condemned, the architects turned to mathematics. Geometry became their dialect, and they concealed it openly, behind altars, underneath spires, in the blueprints of monasteries. They embedded ancient wisdom into the very foundation stones the church rested upon. One chapel I examined contained a secret diagram carved beneath plaster layers. When revealed, it displayed a complete star map, perfectly synchronized with the structure. The church had obscured it centuries earlier, likely never comprehended its meaning. But the original architects knew they were transmitting a message about time, about celestial bodies, about something the Vatican preferred forgotten. Some cathedrals were even constructed to vibrate with sound at specific frequencies, not accidentally, by design. Frequencies that matched ancient musical intervals connected to restoration, to contemplation, to heightened consciousness. The builders possessed knowledge the clergy lacked, or perhaps the clergy understood too, and elected to. Remain silent makes you question how much knowledge has vanished, or more disturbingly, how much has been deliberately concealed. Because if a window's shape can indicate a lost planet or a corridor's path can reflect a sacred formula, then the church stands upon a riddle it never resolved, or claimed ignorance of. The architects couldn't speak freely, but they built with purpose. Every stroke, every measurement, every stone formed part of a communication. And they created that communication not for monarchs or cardinals, but for posterity, for those who would someday wonder why this place feels extraordinary. Why does it resonate with something more ancient than devotion? Because certain truths cannot be proclaimed. They must be engraved, expressed through mathematics and stone and stillness, and they remain awaiting interpretation. There exists the church everyone observes, the one with balconies and benedictions and bells that ring across urban skylines. The one conducting ceremonies publicly and making declarations before cameras. But beyond that facade, some claim another church exists, one that doesn't address the masses, one that doesn't report to the Pope. A concealed authority beneath the surface, manipulating events with quiet efficiency. They name it the church beneath the church. I initially encountered whispers of it from an elderly academic in Rome. He refused to speak names aloud, but revealed symbols carved in places no visitor should ever witness. Peculiar markings on library surfaces, stamps on correspondence that bypassed normal procedures. He explained if the Vatican was a theatre, and this was behind the scenes, the command centre, the silent observer monitoring everything. This secret organisation isn't documented in public records. You won't locate it in Vatican listings or progress reports, but the evidence exists. Choices made without justification, clergymen who ascend to authority with no apparent background. Complete initiatives launched, then abandoned without explanation. Someone initiates those decisions, but it's not always the figure in white robes. There are whispers of a committee, not cardinals, not bishops. Something more ancient, something more discreet. Individuals who don't wear vestments, but who possess centuries of knowledge and influence. People claim they convene in the underground levels of Vatican City, chambers without titles, passages that lead to storage areas protected not merely by barriers, but by secrecy. One evening in the archives, I discovered a classified journal. It mentioned a location called the Black Room. No specifics, only that it existed below where official documentation ends. A priest had been tasked with cleaning nearby once. He recorded only, "I detected voices beyond the stone. They realised I was eavesdropping. Even the Pope isn't exempt from this shadow." Some suspect he receives briefings but isn't fully informed, that he functions as the representative, while others direct the flow of finances, politics, doctrine and memory. This would clarify why popes occasionally discuss reform, but then become silent. Why inquiries get raised but never resolved. Why history continues repeating in patterns too orchestrated to be accidental. The church beneath the church doesn't pursue adherence. It pursues order, conservation, authority over what is recalled and what is eliminated. It doesn't require prayers or processions, only compliance and silence. If this hidden power network is authentic, it transforms everything. It means the Vatican isn't simply a religious establishment, it's a facade. And behind that facade are influences that have moulded rulers, destroyed empires, and rewritten centuries without ever emerging into daylight. And perhaps the most frightening aspect is if the church beneath the church exists. We were never intended to discover, which makes you contemplate what else it conceals and how profound the reality truly extends. Certain years leave an impression. Conflicts begin, monarchs perish, meteors streak across heavens. But then there are years that seem too peaceful, too seamless, like chapters inserted into a narrative that nobody recalls reading. These aren't simply vacant years. Some believe they never occurred whatsoever. Welcome to the hypothesis of the year that never existed. It began with a question: why does it seem like particular centuries left no evidence behind? From approximately 614 to 911 AD, the world appeared strangely empty. Limited documentation, no significant innovations, no enduring structures. Entire generations passed with virtually nothing to demonstrate for it. Scholars term it the Dark Ages. But what if that darkness was manufactured? What if someone extinguished the lights intentionally? This is where the phantom time hypothesis emerges. A proposition that roughly 300 years of history were simply created, not misplaced, not overlooked, counterfeited, fabricated by influential rulers who desired to revise their position in time. The primary suspects are Otto III, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Pope Sylvester II. Together they possessed the resources, the motivation, and the mechanisms to alter the calendar itself. According to this theory, Otto desired to reign in the year 1000, a year of prophecy and renewal. But he was born prematurely. So instead of waiting, he modified the dates, inserted years, relocated events. Suddenly, his rule aligned perfectly with the millennium, and the Church assisted in confirming it. After all, if time was being revised by the devout, it must be heavenly, correct? The Julian and Gregorian calendars provide this theory ammunition. When the transition occurred in 1582, 10 days were eliminated to correct drift. But some argue the adjustment should have been much greater, as if the absent time was never genuine to begin with. Astronomy supports it. Documented eclipses don't always align where they should appear. Stars seem displaced by centuries. It's as if the heavens remember something we don't. Even certain monarchs feel like phantoms. Charlemagne, for instance. His domain was enormous. His reputation is even greater. But the actual proof for his existence is peculiar. Most of what we understand comes from documents composed long after he allegedly died. Sculptures, texts, and currency all appear too pristine, too flawless, as if they were created to complete the gaps. Naturally, mainstream historians dismiss this. They argue the theory is defective, that human mistakes and missing records explain the voids. But still the sensation persists, that history is filled with substitutes, years we studied, but never truly experienced. Rulers we're instructed to respect, but who left no traces behind. The concept that time could be falsified is frightening, because if you can counterfeit the past, you can dictate the future. You determine what preceded, who mattered, what was erased. You mould reality itself, And perhaps that's why the church participated, not merely to validate the deception but to safeguard it. Because once you acknowledge time can be modified, you must question what else has been rewritten, and how much of what we understand was never authentic at all. It was tiny, just a creased piece of parchment hidden between pages of an unrelated manuscript. No marking, no identification, no reason it should have endured. But it did. And when the priest unfolded it, he recognized immediately this wasn't meant to survive. The ink was dim, but the language was precise, a combination of Latin and a dialect used only by scribes deep within the Vatican. It wasn't a prayer, it wasn't a confession, it was an order, a set of commands dated over 800 years ago. And at the bottom, a name that shouldn't have been present. A name connected to a council that history insists never occurred. The document detailed the intentional destruction of specific texts. Not heretical writings, not pagan ceremonies, but early versions of scripture itself, gospel portions, astronomical documentation, treatises on healing and sound and light. The catalogue continued. Some had already disappeared from every known collection. Others had never been recorded to begin with. It was as if someone had created a void in time and memory. And here it was, outlined in precise, careful penmanship. What impressed the priest most was the manner. It wasn't frantic or severe. It was composed, systematic, as if eliminating knowledge was simply another aspect of church upkeep, like cleaning the floors or repairing garments. There was no remorse, just a single concluding statement. The faithful must not recall what never benefited the faith. For days the priest contemplated the document. He reread it, referenced names, dates, expressions. One location surfaced twice. A locked chamber beneath a basilica in Ravenna. Officially, it was merely a tomb, unused and unremarkable. But an ancient map revealed something more. A second level below the tomb. No steps, no entrance, as if it had been constructed and buried within the same century. That was the moment he cracked. He had accepted silence for years, made peace with enigmas, even ignored discoveries when he found books with absent chapters and shelves. That transformed overnight. But this was different. This was evidence that there was a strategy, that forgetting had been arranged long ago, like worship. He understood he couldn't retain it, so he reproduced the document manually, not electronically. Not scanned ink on parchment like the original. He hid the copy somewhere no one would anticipate, a place not even the church would consider searching. And the original? He incinerated it, not from terror, but to eliminate his path, to ensure they wouldn't trace the disclosure. Back to him. What it suggested was straightforward and catastrophic. That memory had been militarized, that forgetting was not a defect of history, but a feature of dominance. And the church wasn't simply a guardian of the sacred, it was a selector of reality, choosing what remained and quietly erasing what did not. The seal had been shattered, and for the first time he wasn't merely a priest, he was observer, and that made him hazardous. There are things the church continues to dread, not explosives or demonstrations or furious correspondence, but inquiries. Ancient inquiries that never received responses. Inquiries that pull at threads they laboured for centuries to bury. Not because they don't know the responses, but because they do. The truth isn't always noisy. Sometimes it waits in stillness, in secured compartments, in deteriorating manuscripts with names no one speaks aloud. And the greatest secret isn't about angels or devils or even Christ. It's about time, about who composed the story we all exist within, and what they excluded intentionally. If people discovered that complete centuries were forged, that calendars were modified to manufacture a prophecy, or that the stars we observe don't correspond to the dates we're given, the deception would crumble. If they witnessed how science was replaced with miracles and how entire civilizations were covered by saints, the fractures would be too extensive to conceal. They dread the Gospel of Thomas because it states the kingdom of God is already present. They dread Mary Magdalene because she wasn't simply a disciple, she was an instructor. They dread ancient maps that display continents that no longer exist and devices that predate the church by millennia. Not because these things are wicked, but because they demonstrate we've been deceived. The deception functions because it feels comprehensive. You mature learning that history is resolved, that the past is a direct path, but it's not. It's filled with revisions, gaps, replacements, and behind each alteration is an intention, dominance. Because if you control the past, you decide who matters presently. You decide what people can envision tomorrow. What they still fear most is inquisitiveness, genuine inquisitiveness. The type that doesn't halt at Sunday school responses or dusty textbooks. The type that reads prohibited books and asks why this section is absent. The type that observes the stars and wonders why they don't align with the church's calendar. The type that hears silence and listens more intently. They dread the return of forgotten names. Names that once opened passages and healed bodies and moved stone with sound. They dread someone entering a cathedral and realizing the carvings aren't merely decoration, they're directions. They dread that once the truth is perceived, it can't be unseen. That memory will awaken and not return to sleep. This isn't about destroying faith, it's about liberating it, about raising the curtain and allowing people to choose what to believe with their eyes completely open. Because faith built on fear isn't faith, it's control. So if you've reached this point, you already sense it, that irritation in the back of your mind, that feeling that something doesn't calculate. Don't dismiss it, pursue it, question everything, because the greatest fear of those in authority is not revolt, it's remembrance. And sometimes remembering is the most perilous thing you can do. But it's also the most crucial. The story they shared was always identical, that the light dimmed, that darkness descended over the world, that people forgot how to reason, how to construct, how to dream. They labelled it the Dark Ages, like the world itself went sightless. But perhaps the truth is more straightforward. Perhaps the light wasn't lost. Perhaps it was concealed. There are embers still burning under centuries of debris, not just in books or ruins, but in you. In the questions that won't abandon you. In the peaceful moments when something doesn't feel correct. When the story sounds too polished, too tidy, too edited, the truth is not vanished. It's dispersed, confined in vaults, encrypted in stone, murmurs transmitted through paintings, blueprints, cathedrals and legends. The flame never extinguished. They simply constructed barriers around it, and now those barriers are beginning to fracture. You don't need authorization to ask questions. You don't need a collar, a credential, or a blessing to wonder what came previously. You just need to care sufficiently, to look, to read between the lines, to notice what's absent, because what they eliminated still reverberates. The pages they burned still cast shadows, and memory has a method of finding its way back. This journey was never about hatred or vengeance. It was about remembering, reclaiming, observing the world not as they want you to perceive it, but as it truly is. A place abundant with knowledge that never belonged to one faction. A planet where truth doesn't submit to titles or robes. And perhaps the greatest secret isn't in some concealed archive under the Vatican. Perhaps it's in the fact that you were never meant to forget. That deep down you always knew something was incorrect. That all those so-called heresies and banned gospels and missing centuries aren't just errors, they're signals, evidence, alerts. That truth isn't what we're given, it's what we discover. The light was never lost. It was entombed under fear, obedience and silence. But you're here now, and that signifies something. It signifies you're willing to see, willing to experience the unease that comes with knowing you've been deceived, willing to ask what else they attempted to keep from you. And you're not alone. There are others, quiet voices rising, artists, dreamers, former priests, historians, rebels. People excavating the past not to destroy it, but to free it. People who believe that light belongs to everyone, not just the selected few. So carry it, pass it forward, protect it when they try to suppress it again, because they will. But this time it's different. This time we remember. And that changes everything.